The sun over the high lonesome was a merciless bronze coin, hammered flat against a sky bleached of all mercy, and it baked the hard-pan dirt of the ranch yard into a cracked, pale mosaic that stretched towards a horizon forever out of reach. It shimmered in relentless waves off the corrugated tin roof of the barn, a blinding sheet of light that hurt to look at for more than a second. Inside that barn, in the stripe of shadow and dust, moted light that felt both like a sanctuary and a cage, stood Elara, her boots stirring the fine golden chaff that littered the packed earth floor. At 19, she was a creature of this harsh landscape, all sharp angles and a quiet resilience that was less a quality and more a necessity for survival. Her hands calloused from years of tending to stubborn things, horses, fences, her own heart, now clutching the handle of an oaken feed bucket as if it were the only solid thing in a world tilting on its axis. Before her, a monolithic presence blocked the light, casting her in a long, cool shadow that seemed to siphon the very warmth from her skin. He was simply called the Giant by the folks in the distant town, a name spoken with a mixture of awe and unease over watered-down whiskey. But to Elara he was Papa, a fact as fundamental and unchangeable as the mountains that rimmed their valley. He wasn't just a tall man, he was a geography of his own, shoulders like mountain plateaus beneath a weathered duster, perpetually dusted with trail grit, and hands that could cradle a newborn lamb or break a wild stallion with equal, terrifying ease, his Stetson so broad it seemed to hold a piece of the night sky permanently under its brim, hiding his eyes in a perpetual shroud of mystery and judgment. Pulpa. Elara's voice was small in the cavernous quiet of the barn, a sparrow's chirp against a canyon wall, swallowed almost instantly by the heavy, sweet smell of hay and the faint, musky scent of the cattle in the distant pens. The Giant didn't turn, his immense frame a statue of focused attention, his gaze fixed on something outside the wide barn door, something in the past that only he could see, a memory or a ghost that held him in its thrall. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring, each second punctuated by the lazy buzz of a fly and the frantic thumping of her own heart against her ribs, a trapped thing beating for a freedom she could no longer imagine. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, the sound of distant rocks shifting deep in the earth, a vibration she felt in her bones more than heard with her ears. Your mom took it better. The words landed not as a statement, but as a verdict, a final judgment passed on her character before the trial had even begun, and they were devoid of any warmth or fatherly concern, a simple, stark comparison that carved a hollow space inside her chest. Elara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach, a sickening dread that coiled and slithered through her insides because she knew, with a certainty that was as chilling as a winter wind, what it was. It was the talk, the one she'd been dreading since her body first began to hint at womanhood, curving in places that were once straight, a betrayal of her own form that had drawn his appraising, heavy-lidded gaze. It was about the claiming, an old tradition, older than the ranch itself, passed down through her father's line like a cursed heirloom, a ritual of passage from girlhood into the family, a night that was spoken of in hushed, solemn tones by the few weathered ranch hands who knew of it, their eyes downcast afterwards. Elara had heard whispers, seen the way her mother would sometimes get a distant, glazed look in her eyes when the subject was obliquely referenced, a fragile vase with a hairline crack, beautiful but forever damaged. Her mother, a delicate woman from the East with laughter like wind chimes, and a fondness for pressed flowers and poetry, who had withered and faded like one of her own specimens in this brutal country, the light in her eyes slowly dimming until a fever, 2 winters past, had simply carried away the ghost she had already become. Took what better, Papa? Elara asked, her throat tight and dry, though she knew the answer with every fiber of her being. She needed to hear him say it, to anchor this abstract, suffocating dread in the concrete, brutal reality of his words, to make the nightmare real, so she could perhaps find a way to fight it. The Giant shifted, the leather of his gear and his heavy belt creaking a protest against the movement. the sound stark and threatening in the quiet. He turned his head slightly, and a single hard eye gleamed from the deep shadow of his hat, a flash of flinty assessment that missed nothing, not the tremor in her hands, nor the fear widening her own eyes. "The stretching," he said, the word blunt and crude, a tool meant to wound, hanging in the air between them like a physical blow. "The night I made her a woman, a true woman of this land," she cried. "Sure, all women do, but she understood it was necessary. She was strong where it counted, didn't fight the raw of it." Elara's breath hitched in her chest, a sharp, pained sound. The raw of it? The phrase was like a shard of ice plunged directly into her soul, speaking of a pain that was more than physical, a rending that went down to the spirit. She thought of her mother's gentle hands, so often tucked inside a pair of her own worn leather gloves, her love for sonnets and soft, flowing fabrics that felt alien against the rough wool and denim of this place, and she couldn't reconcile that fragile, beautiful image with the grim, stoic acceptance her father described, a story that felt like a lie he had told himself so many times it had become his truth. "I'm not Mama," she whispered, her defiance a fragile green shoot trying to push through sun, baked clay, a last, desperate claim to her own identity in the face of his overwhelming will. "No," he agreed, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that seemed to suck the very air from the barn, leaving her light-headed. "You are my daughter, my blood, and this land demands its price. It will not be gentle with you, Elara. I, at least, will make it purposeful." He finally turned to face her fully, and the sheer scale of him was a physical pressure, pushing her back a half-step, his presence filling the entire space, leaving no room for her fear, for herself. He took a single, ground-shaking step forward, and the space between them, once a safe distance for a daughter to address her father, now felt like a trap about to be sprung, the jaws of his intention closing around her. "Tonight," he said, the word final as a tombstone sealing shut, leaving no room for argument, no room for hope. "After sundown, you will be ready." He didn't wait for a reply, didn't acknowledge the silent tears that had begun to trace clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. He turned and strode out of the barn, his bulk swallowing the rectangle of blinding sunlight at the door, leaving her alone in the sudden, profound silence, the dust motes settling around her like a shroud. The words "your mom took it better" echoed in the hollow spaces of her fear, a taunt and a condemnation. The feed bucket slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the packed earth with a dull, hollow thud that was the only sound left in her world. The ranch house was a tomb holding the ghost of her mother, every creak of its old timber bones a whisper of a past life that felt as distant and unreachable as the moon. Elara moved through the parlor like a spectre herself, her fingers trailing over the spine of a gilt-edged book of sonnets, the smooth, cool wood of the piano no one had played in years, its keys yellowed like old teeth. Each object was a relic of a different, softer world, a world of cultivated gardens and gentle conversation that had been systematically erased by the relentless sun and the rigid, uncompromising will of her father. She climbed the stairs to her room, each step a leaden effort, as if she were wading through deep water, the weight of the impending night an anchor tied to her soul. The evening sun cast long, distorted shadows that clawed at the floral print wallpaper her mother had once chosen, the patterns now looking like skeletal fingers grasping for a lost elegance. In the fading, bruised light of dusk, she looked at her reflection in the wavy glass of her window, seeing not herself but a haunted amalgamation of her parents. She saw her mother's eyes, wide and fearful, the same shade of summer sky, now clouded with a storm of dread, set in the unforgiving line of her father's own stubborn jaw, a feature she had once been proud of but now saw as a curse, a physical manifestation of the trap she was in. Your mom took it better. The comparison was a weapon honed to a sharp, psychological edge, and it had found its mark deep within her. It wasn't just about the physical act he planned. It was a test of her worth, her mettle, her right to be called his daughter and a woman of this brutal land. Was she as strong, as stoically accepting as the woman he had, in his memory, canonized? Or was she weaker, a flawed copy, a disappointment before the ritual had even begun? The desperate, clawing need to prove herself, to be deemed worthy in his implacable eyes, warred with a primal, screaming terror that made her want to vomit. She thought of running, the impulse a sudden, electric jolt that straightened her spine and sent her gaze darting towards the door. But where would she go? The desert stretched for 100 miles in every direction, a vast, thirsty grave of rattlesnakes, scorpions, and desperate men, a landscape that had swallowed whole wagon trains and offered up only their son, bleached bones. The town, they feared her father, viewed him as a necessary force of nature, a power you appeased but did not cross. They would bring her back with averted eyes, or worse, they would look the other way, reinforcing her absolute solitude. She was trapped, not just by the unforgiving geography of the land, but by the heavier, more inescapable chains of blood and tradition, a legacy of ownership written not in paper, but in the very DNA she carried. As full dark fell, blanketing the world in a deep, star-pricked indigo that did nothing to soothe her, but instead felt like a suffocating blanket, she heard his heavy, deliberate tread on the porch below. The sound was a slow, rhythmic drumbeat, a countdown to an inevitable hour, each footfall a hammer's strike on the coffin of her childhood. She didn't light a lamp, preferring the anonymity of the shadows, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed, still wearing her simple work dress, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white bone in the gloom, her nails leaving half moon impressions in her palms. The front door opened and closed with a soft, definitive click, and the house itself seemed to hold its breath, the very air growing still and thick with anticipation. She could hear him moving below, the heavy, solid sounds of his presence a violation of the quiet, the distinct clink of a glass bottle against the rim of a tumbler. Not whiskey, she knew. He kept a clear, potent liquor distilled from a bitter desert root, something, he said, cleared the mind for hard things, a brew that stripped away sentiment and left only cold, hard purpose. Then the stairs began to groan their protest, a slow, agonizing symphony of wood straining under immense weight. Creak, thud, each sound was a hammer blow against her frayed nerves, a precise and escalating torture. She could picture him perfectly, one massive hand on the banister, his duster whispering against the wall like a serpent's passage, his progress slow, inevitable, and utterly terrifying. The sound grew louder, closer, a monstrous approach that filled the entire upstairs hallway, until it stopped with a final, resonating thud just outside her door. The simple, brass knob began to turn, slow and sure, with no hesitation, the mechanism making a soft, metallic snick that was deafening in the silence. The door swung inward on complaining hinges, and he filled the frame, a silhouette of immense, barely contained power against the dim light of the hallway, blotting out everything else in her world. The scent of him washed into the room ahead of him, old leather, horse, dry dust, and that sharp, medicinal tang of the root liquor, a smell she had always associated with him, but that now smelled only of dread. He stepped inside, and the floorboards bowed under his weight, a quiet, physical acknowledgment of his dominance. In one hand he held a small, rough-spun towel, the kind used for drying down a sweaty horse or stanching a bleeding wound. In the other, a familiar clay jar of thick, pungent salve she recognized from treating the deep, ragged cuts on the leaf stalk, a sight that sent a fresh wave of nausea crashing over her. His eyes, long adjusted to the dark, found her instantly in the gloom, pinning her to the spot with the intensity of his gaze, a long, appraising look that stripped her bare more effectively than any disrobing, assessing her readiness, her fear, her very soul. He didn't speak, the silence itself a form of violence, and simply set the jar and the towel on her small, plain bedside table with a soft, definitive click that seemed to seal her fate. "Lie down, girl." He rumbled, his voice a low, approaching storm in the quiet of the room, devoid of any tenderness, any fatherly comfort. "The land won't wait, and neither will I." Elara's heart was a wild, frantic bird beating itself to a pulp against the cage of her ribs, a final, desperate protest. This was it, the stretching, the moment she was to be remade, broken and reshaped on his anvil into something that could endure this life, her identity subsumed into the harsh legacy of the land. As she slowly, tremulously, lay back against her thin pillow, the rough cotton abrasive against her cheek, the last thing she saw was his huge, work-roughened hands, methodically unbuttoning the thick cuffs of his shirt, preparing for their grim, purposeful work. The only thought in her mind, a desperate, silent scream into the void that he was about to fill, was, "But I am not my mother."